long ago, I was at a banquet with folks from the fire department. And you know, it was one of those things where I had to wear a fancy dress and heels and dance the night away and eat a nice meal with a glass of wine. I know it's a very, very rough life. Well, that night I answered the shocked question of, you drink alcohol? Many times. And actually this happens to me fairly often. And it's probably based on assumptions of what a pastor does and does not do, or my sort of health-conscious ways. It's probably one or the other. But yes, I am over 21, and I have the occasional glass of wine. And while it's certainly not my normal course of action, there have been a few times in my life where I have had too much to drink, mostly during college. So I also know what it's like to be drunk. And I'm not advocating it, nor do I think the Bible is advocating it. There are a lot of dangers associated with alcohol. However, 2,000 years ago, there was a big party going on. Pentecost marked the beginning of the harvest season. It was time to bring in the bounty, time to eat your fill. Even the poor and needy were given enough to eat and drink. The silence, which typically greets Pentecost today in comparison to Christmas or Easter, is peculiar, given the rowdiness of Pentecost then, even before the Spirit came and whipped through the party. As a matter of fact, if any of the festival days of the church are days to give gifts, Pentecost is it. It's all about abundance and generosity and merrymaking. And as a side note, if you opened up your Stay Connected, that little email blast you get each week, if you opened it up this past week, there was a link in it. And I suggested that you could give a Pentecost gift. If you click on that link, if you go back through your email, if you have it, you can give an alternative gift through Gifts of Hope. You can do this at any time. But the great thing about it is it ensures that somebody who really does need some increase in their harvest and bounty will receive that. So check it out if you didn't see it. Anyway, basically there's this giant party going on that even God was invited to. As a matter of fact, God was the guest of honor. Everyone had gathered to give thanks and praise for all that God had given to them. Well, on Sunday mornings, we gather here essentially to do that exact same thing. Give thanks to God for all that God has given to us. Well, sometimes, and maybe a lot of the times is more accurate, I forget that even my very breath is a gift from God. So when I hear of this large gathering of people all coming together to thank God for everything, before they will even pluck a plant from the ground, I can't help but wonder if they ever forgot where it came from. I feel a little jealous of how on fire their hearts seem to be, how delirious with thanks they are. I'd like to feel that way too. But they must forget sometimes, because God's always pulling them back and gathering them in. And maybe having a party is a way to remember this, because basically they're worshiping. Someone recently asked me what the purpose of worship is. And I remember stumbling around a bit for the proper words to describe worship. And in hindsight, I should have just said, it's a chance to get together and have a grand party in God's honor. Well, apparently these guys are partying hard. So much so that people think they're drunk. I mentioned to Phyllis this past week about these Jesus party animals. And she thought that a good way to get the true party atmosphere of Pentecost going would be for me to jump out of a cake. And I thought that might be pushing it a little bit too far. But I did think I'd keep you awake by pumping you full of sugar. Probably not amazed and astonished like on that first Pentecost, but awake nonetheless. Partying a little here on Pentecost. So Andy and Janet and Jennifer are going to pass out cupcakes for you to eat during the sermon to ensure you will actually stay awake. So while they do that, we're going to go back to partying 2,000 years ago. So they're not drunk, but they do appear drunk. I think the general assumption we make about this story is that the onlookers, the Jews, think the Galileans have had a bit too much wine because they start talking in tongues. We have this vision of a bunch of babbling and gobbledygook being spewed about on Pentecost. And that's probably a bit about what's going on, but the statement of they are filled with new wine says more than that. What is it that is happening that makes people looking on, that makes them think they are drunk? Because they're not. It's God's Spirit that's making them act in this way. As weird, as uncomfortable as it is to preach about, the truth of the matter is, often if we've had a bit too much wine, or been around someone who has had a bit too much wine, we know that babble isn't necessarily all that's going on. We know that when inhibitions are lowered, often passions and buried emotions rise to the surface. We know that a lot of truth is proclaimed or enacted in those times. And we also know that our words and deeds, whether we've had too much to drink or not, have the power to hurt one another. They have the power to divide rather than bring together. See, the vision of what's going on here isn't pointless jibber-jabber. The fact of the matter is the Spirit comes to help as much as mess up things. The fact is that God's Spirit gathers in the unexpected and even the uninvited. The fact is, the Spirit's presence is at least as disruptive as it is comforting. So when we say, "Come, Holy Spirit," is that what we really want? Because in some real ways, it is like being drunk on wine. It can hold just as much confusion as truth. Their speech and actions are affected by the onset of the Spirit, and they begin to enact the language of God, a universal language, one that all can understand. Now, I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly what was said or how it was enacted, but I do know this. The language of God has always been and will always be about truth and grace and mercy, unending forgiveness and sacrificial love. And this the people cannot resist. This is what they actually drink deeply from. Intoxicated by the Spirit, their inhibitions are lowered, and the stories they tell of God breathe life into hundreds of people in a week. They are like wine themselves. Others drink from their experiences. They were filled by the Spirit in order for the Spirit to be poured out from them. This is what God has been doing since the beginning of time. God poured himself out so that creation could be birthed. And God's Spirit covered over all of it. And God poured himself out in Jesus so that humanity might fall into true grace and love. And God's Spirit resurrected life even when that type of love seemed unimaginable. And God pours out the Holy Spirit into his children so that the people themselves might become new wine for the world. Since God's been pouring himself out since the beginning of time, there is no reason to think that God would stop now. The Spirit is still being poured. Because the world was thirsty then, and it is just as thirsty today. And God calls us to be new wine and new wineskins. This is actually what Jesus says in one part in Luke. And I love it, especially in conjunction with the Spirit being poured out. Basically, Jesus says, those who follow my ways themselves are new wine, bursting the seams of the wineskins. We are the new wine of the Spirit, something different for people to try. 2 weeks ago, I was having a post-marathon celebratory dinner with friends. And the restaurant was out of the Cabernet that I wanted. And the waitress said, do you just want the house Cabernet? And I'm not that distinguishing of a wine drinker. And I said, sure, that would be fine. And one of my friends, knowing that it wouldn't satisfy me, knowing that I would want something with more depth, looked at me and said, hey, do you trust me? How about if I get you something? And he picked. But what I really remember is him asking me, do you trust me? And I did. Which is why I was willing to let him offer me something else. And this week I've been thinking about that. How he looked at me and somehow knew what I would like. And through his actions was willing to say, I know something about this. Because he did. And I think it's that way with God. I know that all of us have family and friends who are unsatisfied with life. Like they've eaten their fill of cupcakes and have recognized that the sugar high isn't going to really take them very far. And that there's great depth embodied to the Spirit. And I wonder what it would be like in those moments when they're looking for something to drink, when we say, do you trust me? Because I've got a story to tell you. Because you have them. You know, you have the stories and the experiences, the questions about God. And you may not know the words to use, but God does. And mostly, the specificity of the words doesn't matter. Kind of like when I didn't have the right words to describe worship. What matters is the conversation. What matters is you're there. What matters is you're talking about life and God. What matters is you are the one that God's using as new wine. Uninhibited, passionate, and truthful. That's what being intoxicated on the Spirit of God is all about. I'd say it's something to join, because it's going to be a pretty phenomenal party.